Well, Happy New Year to all of you. Welcome to a new year. We're in 2019. Hard to believe. The years are just going by so fast. But anyway, Happy New Year. Hope everybody's doing well and getting off to a good start in this new year. Here on Loving the Scriptures, we are going to get back in depth in the book of Acts. Last time, we just did a general overview of everything that we've covered from chapter 1 through chapter 17, just to kind of get our bearings in the whole book. And now we're going to pick up where we left off in chapter 18, which is going to catalog Paul's missionary adventures in the city of Corinth, another city that many of us are probably familiar with or have heard about, given the fact that Paul has written 2 epistles to that particular church. A very challenging place to preach the gospel, but just as always, we're going to see the Lord at work in their midst, in and through the Apostle Paul as he ministers. So it's going to be a great display of God's power once again. Hopefully we can pay attention to that and be really encouraged by that. Hope you stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. All right, so like I said, we're going to be getting back into Acts. For myself personally, it's just kind of trying to get back on track and getting back into the groove of things. Just as we, in doing a talk through of the book of Acts, like we normally did, like we normally have done before several weeks ago, when we left off in chapter 17. Last week doesn't count. I don't feel like I got back into the groove of Acts just by doing the overview, because it wasn't like any other episode that we've done surrounding the things that we've talked about in the book of Acts. Yes, last week was just one big general overview, which reminds me, if you are just discovering Loving the Scriptures, or this is your first time listening, we've been going through a study of the book of Acts for a while now, and you can definitely, if you would like to, go back to the past episodes and listen to everything that we've talked about up to this point. But one thing that you can do, and hopefully it'll be helpful for you, is that you can just listen to the last episode and just get the full overview from chapter 1 through chapter 17. Now, you can do that, but again, the disadvantage that you have in that is that I don't go into all the depths of details of everything that we've covered. Remember, it's just a general sort of overview of the things that we've talked about. It doesn't go into detail of some of the insights we've uncovered, some of the details of the stories and that sort of thing, and things that we can draw from the text that are really beneficial, and just some of the personal lessons that we can learn from those sorts of things. So there's still a lot that's left out. So, but if you want to catch your bearings on just where we are, you can go back and listen to that and then start listening from this time forward, or you can just start listening now and go forward. I mean, it really doesn't matter. Like I've said several times, what I try to do is I try to make this in a way where you can come in at any time. How successful I am at that, I'm not sure. But whatever the case, I think that there's always something that you can gather or glean from each episode from wherever we are in the book of Acts. And so if there's something particular in a particular episode in the middle of our study of the book of Acts that touches your heart, or God uses to speak to you through, then I think that's an incredible thing, and I would consider that a win. So anyway, we are going to get right back at it into the book of Acts, and we're going to go into chapter 18. And like I said, we're going to be looking at Paul in the city of Corinth. Like I said, a lot of you, you understand Corinth to be a city. The province in which Corinth is housed is in a province called Achaia, and it is about 50 miles west of Athens. Excuse me, just kind of lost my thought there. And that's where we left off last time. That's where Paul was last time when we were looking at him in chapter 17. In chapter 17, he was in Athens. He was preaching the gospel in the Areopagus, or the Hill of Ares, also known as Mars Hill. because a lot of the Greek philosophers in that area were curious about the things that Paul was speaking about, because Paul had been speaking both in the synagogues and in the marketplaces about the gospel. And the reason why he did that is because he was so stirred up and disturbed by all of the displays of paganism in the form of idolatry all throughout the city. And so that prompted him to preach the gospel in Athens, and he in Athens, and then as people were hearing more about what he was saying, they said, "What is this babbler?" Or in the original language, literally a seed picker. What is this seed picker talking about? So they invite him up to the Areopagus, and remember what I encouraged you to do when we were in that area. I encouraged you to do a comparison between the gospel presentation that Paul makes there in chapter 17 against what he preached in chapter 13. And there you see how Paul approaches preaching the gospel to two different audiences. In chapter 13, he's dealing with Jews and Gentile proselytes to Judaism. So there's more of a Judaistic approach to introducing Christ to those people. But then here you have not only Gentiles, but you have Gentiles deeply steeped in paganism. And one of the things that Paul does is that he takes the things of paganism and uses that as a springboard to talk about the one true God and Jesus Christ, his son. And if you remember, one of the things that he does that kicks this whole thing off, he says, "I noticed that you had an altar to an unknown God. So this unknown God that you worship, I'm going to introduce him to you." And so from there, he talks about Christ. And so, you have the same thing here as you see in a lot of places. You have some people who accept and other people who reject. Those who rejected him were, I think their big hang-up, just based on the text, is the fact that he was talking about the resurrection of the dead. And based on the philosophical understanding of many of the people at that time, there was no such thing as the resurrection of the dead. Immortality of the soul, yes. Bodily resurrection from the dead, not so much. And so when Paul started talking about that, you had some people who sneered at him and mocked, but you had other people who accepted as well. And so that's basically where we left off there. And so as we get into chapter 18, Paul's missionary journey continues. And again, just as a reminder, this is in his second missionary journey. And that missionary journey is about to come to a close. You kind of get some fast-moving movements and narratives of the ending part of the second missionary journey in the middle of chapter 18. We're not going to cover that today, but he's also going to quickly start into the third missionary journey, also as well in the middle of in the middle of this chapter 18. So a lot of things going on, but like I said, though, we understand, we're familiar with Corinth, mainly because Paul would write his two epistles to the church in Corinth. And if you know, even just from any analysis of that epistle or those two epistles, you understand that the Corinthian church had a lot of problems. Now, this is him addressing problems within the church at Corinth. But you see, one of the things that was the church's problem was the cultural influence around them. They allowed certain things with the culture around them to influence them into things that they shouldn't be doing, or being lackadaisical about taking care of things that were seeping into the church based on cultural understandings and cultural behaviors that were going on around them. If there was one place where you would think that perhaps there was a challenge, it would be a challenge to plant a church and to grow up a church, it would be in Corinth. Corinth was kind of like a sin city of its day, if you really want to call it that. So really, when we look at what we're going to look at here in chapter 18, we're going to see what it looks like for the gospel to penetrate into Sin City. But all of this to say, though, is that the city of Corinth itself was a very immoral place. Most of what makes up that immorality, certainly not all, but most of it, and what it's most known for, is for its sexual immorality. And I think that can be both inside and outside the pagan sphere. Definitely within the pagan sphere, just because, and I don't think anything like that is unique to Corinth necessarily, but Corinth is just the one place where it was really prominent and mostly practiced, where probably is what I would guess, where temple prostitution took place, and really when things like that happened, you have to understand, that was one of the ways that people who followed these pagan religions, where they had temple prostitutes, that was their way of getting in contact or getting in connection with the gods that they worshiped, or one of the gods that they wanted to communicate with and that they worshiped. Whereas Christians, we just pray. In the pagan world back at that time, it wouldn't be unusual for somebody to seek connection with God through sexual intercourse with a temple priestess, or a temple prostitute. And so that was just one of the things that was going on in Corinth, but it was one of the things that it was best known for, and it had a reputation. That was what made up its reputation. Okay, so much to the point that to call somebody a Corinthian was to, even if they weren't a Corinthian, and you called somebody a Corinthian, what you were trying to convey in that is that you saw them as an immoral person. Okay, to Corinthianize, that became a term, which really was a way of saying that that was the way of engaging in sexual immorality. So the whole name of the town was connected to this whole thing of immorality and sexual immorality. So you can imagine. I mean, just imagine. This is the reputation that this place has, and you as a Christian coming in, you're saying, okay, this is where we are next going to preach the gospel. What sort of success are we going to have in a place like this? Because something like this was rife. This was, you have to understand that this was the normal, this was the normal name of the game in Corinth. And you had a lot of other things going on as well. So all of this just to say that Corinth was not a place where an example was laid out of what true biblical godly morality looked like. Okay, so Corinth was a problem place, and even after the church was established there, and after Paul had left there, problems started to creep in the church, even with sexual immorality. If you look at chapter 5, you have somebody in there who was sleeping around with his father's wife, which implies that it was his stepmother, but nevertheless, it was still very sinful nonetheless. And Corinth was a problem place, but Paul goes there, and he goes there to preach the gospel. Now, there must have been something about Corinth, I don't know, that maybe had Paul set on edge. The Lord Jesus appears to him later, in this chapter, says, "Do not be afraid." You read from Paul's own words in Corinth. He says that I came to you with fear and with much trembling. So there was a little bit of unsettlement in Paul's heart and Paul's mind as he goes into this situation. We usually don't think of Paul as somebody who was fearing and trembling, but he's open about that to the Corinthians themselves when he says, "When I first came to you, I came to you with fear and with much trembling." But so that's kind of what you have that's going on there. And so when we get started off here in chapter 18, let me just start out with the first few verses here, where it says, "After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And he went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. And he reasoned in the synagogues every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks." Okay, now this is what we see going on just in the kickoff of his ministry in Corinth. That's no different than any other place that he does go, as just as we saw there at the end part there, that he goes to the synagogue. So he starts out with the Jews first, and he goes and preaches there. But let's notice a few things even before that, just as we go into this here. It says here that Paul left Athens and he went to Corinth, and he found, verse 2, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. Okay, so what is all of this that's going on here? Well, number one, we're introduced for the first time to Aquila and Priscilla. And you see their names mentioned here and there in Paul's epistles, whether in greeting or whatever. But you get this understanding that these were two, you even get this sense even later on in this chapter, in chapter 18, that you're dealing with a couple of solid people that are in the faith. Some people have wondered whether, when Priscilla and Aquila were already Christians when they were in Rome and then forced to leave, or if they became believers after they had come to Corinth under Paul's preaching. I know that there had been some people wondering that, and that's been a point of discussion. But I think most people, and I would fall in line with this here too. I think most people speculate and are pretty certain that Aquila and Priscilla were already believers in Rome, and when they got kicked out by Claudius. So understand, by the way, that they came from Rome, and Christianity has already been established in Rome. Okay, sometimes people might get this impression that Paul founded the church in Rome. He did not. Okay, there were already Christians established in the city of Rome. And Aquila and Priscilla were probably among that number. Now, what is this whole thing that's going on here with the Emperor Claudius? Because as it says there, Aquila and Priscilla were left Rome. They had formerly been from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. The thing of it is, and most of this comes from the biography that was written by Suetonius some 75 years after this whole incident took place. His biography on Claudius, and Suetonius mentions this whole incident about the expelling of the Jews from the city of Rome by Claudius. And apparently what had happened is that there was a riot. Maybe there had been more than one riot, and maybe that was part of a consistent problem. And the Claudius said, you Jews have got to leave. But apparently what had happened, and this is kind of the understanding that most people have of this, is that Claudius had expelled the Jews because they caused a lot of ruckus from their rioting. And the reason why the Jews were rioting, according to Suetonius, was on account because of Chrestus, or I think he may have termed it in a sense to say that Chrestus was in their midst and was instigating these riots, as if Chrestus was actually on the scene. But I think most people seem to understand that Suetonius inaccurately was saying that Chrestus was the central person who was leading these riots, and what he meant by Chrestus was actually Christos, which is Christ. So basically what we think that Suetonius was trying to say, and probably what had actually happened at that time, was that you had Jews who were in an uproar and rioting because you had these Christians who were coming and preaching Christ. And because it offended the unbelieving, hardened Jews who were there, who heard about these things, they formed a riot. And listen, that's not unusual. We've seen that even in different other places in the book of Acts, haven't we? We've seen that happen to the Apostle Paul, where Paul preaches Christ, and what the Jews do is the Jews will in a couple of occasions, what they did was that they caused up a stir among the Gentiles to convince them to go after the apostles, and so you had even in places like where was it? I think it was in Thessalonica, where you had this sort of thing going on, and you had the whole thing with Jason and everything, and the crowd in an uproar. If you want a reminder of that, just look at the first 15 or so verses probably the first 9, looking at my Bible actually, of Acts chapter 17 that catalogs that. That's just one example of some of the things that happened even in the Apostle Paul's ministry. So it wouldn't be surprising if that's actually what the case was in Rome, where you had Christians who came and they preached, and the Jews had an uproar, made an uproar of everything. And Claudius says, "You guys are causing too much trouble. You all have to leave. You all have to leave, and you all have to leave right now." Okay, and so that thus would explain Aquila, if he was formerly from Italy, having to leave. It was because of Claudius's decree, which shows you something. I mean, which shows you that there was no discriminating division in the minds of the Gentiles between Jews and Christians, at least in some areas of the Roman world. They didn't make a distinction between Jews who are engaged in Judaism and Jews who are Christians. In their mind, and at least in Claudius's mind, it was all having to do with the Jews, so all the Jews had to leave. And so Aquila, who was a Jew, leaves along with his wife, wife Priscilla. Now, Priscilla is an interesting thing, because we think that Priscilla is not a Jew but a Gentile, which would be very amazing. So you have, I guess you could say, an interracial marriage between two believers, obviously. But again, this is one of those things where you have Jew and Gentile come together. Some places, when you read in the scripture, Priscilla's name comes up first, and some people speculate that maybe because she was from a prominent Roman family or something like that. So just a little bit of an understanding of Aquila and Priscilla. So if Priscilla was married to Aquila, and the Jews were kicked out, and she's a Roman, obviously she's going to stick with her husband, and so they leave Rome. And they end up in Corinth, and so that is where Priscilla and Aquila meet Paul. Under what circumstances they met is not very clear. Doesn't say anything about that in Scripture. But basically, all you need to know is that they met somehow. They were of the same trade, and they interacted with one another. And so in the last part of verse 2 and then into verse 3, it says, and he is meaning Paul, went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. Okay, so Paul was housed by Aquila and Priscilla, had that commonality of having the same trade. The thing with the tent maker doesn't necessarily exclusively mean that they made tents. The literal word from the Greek means a leather worker, which could involve all sorts of things. Now, you did make tents from the leather, and there was things having to do with that, but I wouldn't be surprised if Paul, Aquila, and Priscilla did more with leather than just making tents. And so they had a commonality as far as that goes. They were tent makers by trade, and so here you see the bivocational side of Paul. Paul here is not exclusively preaching the gospel and going around preaching the gospel within the city of Corinth. He's spending much of his time in his profession. And by the way, you probably had that in Thessalonica as well. When he was in Thessalonica for the little bit of time that he was there, he was probably doing that as well. And I say that because he says so in 2 Thessalonians, where he said to set an example of how to earn your own bread. He made his own living. So it wouldn't be surprising if he did the same thing in Thessalonica when he was there too. So he's doing the same thing here in Corinth, and he's working full time. And then, as it says there in let's see here, in verse 4, he says, and he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. Okay, so his preaching predominantly and primarily was on the Sabbath, and not really throughout the rest of the week, where he was engaged in his profession and what he was doing. It's somewhat different from what you see, for example, way back in chapter 13 when he was in Pisidia and Antioch. Between the Sabbaths, the impression that you get was that he was fully engaged in teaching the people there who wanted to know more about the Lord Jesus Christ. But here, the emphasis is made is that he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, and he tried to persuade Jews and Greeks, okay? And the Greeks there are probably the Greeks that are proselytes to Judaism, okay? Just like in other places that we've seen where Paul has stopped off and preached the gospel in particular synagogues. So that's probably what you have there. Now, as you get into verse 5 and following, we start to see the same pattern starting to unroll again. If you've been with us in our study of the book of Acts, you're familiar with this pattern, and you're familiar with what this looks like. Okay, so when you see what goes on here in verse 5, it's interesting. It says when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. Okay, so remember, Silas and Timothy, Paul had left them in Macedonia to do their own work, and so they had come back. And so now they've come back. There's a little bit more that kind of goes on, because there's some indication that when he was in Athens, in a period of time that he was in Athens, that he may have actually at the very least seen Timothy. And then Timothy had gone back. When we read about Paul in Athens in chapter 17, it mentions that he was alone, and he probably was alone for a period of time. But one of the things that you read in Thessalonians is that Paul says well, let me just read it here, and it's not anything that we need to make a big deal about, but I mean just to kind of point out things of what's going on. Let's see if I can find it here. First of all, I think it's in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 says, "Therefore, when we could bear it no longer, we were willing to be left behind at Athens alone, and we sent Timothy, our brother, and God's co-worker in the gospel of Christ, to establish and exhort you in your faith, that no one be moved by these afflictions." So the impression that you get, you see there that Timothy at some point was with Paul in Athens, and probably maybe even with Silas as well. And then, with the word of things going on in the Thessalonian church, and wanting to make sure that they're not unsettled by the trials that they're experiencing, Paul says there that we were willing, we could bear it no longer. We were willing to be left behind at Athens alone, and he's probably talking about him and Silas. And we sent Timothy. Paul and Silas sent Timothy, our brother, and God's co-worker. So you get the impression that Timothy and Silas maybe at some point had joined Paul for a little bit, and that's what Paul had told the people that had escorted him to Athens to do, to go back and to tell Timothy and Silas to come and see him and join him in Athens as soon as possible. And so apparently that's what they did, and then he sends Timothy back to check on the Thessalonians. You may have had Silas go back eventually as well to Macedonia, perhaps to Philippi. And then when they come back, one of the things that we read in Philippians is that Paul receives a gift from the from Philippi, and that's probably perhaps where it came from. It came from Silas. This love gift, this offering to kind of financially support Paul. You can read that in Philippians chapter 4. And so in this second visit here, this time to Corinth, that's maybe perhaps where that whole thing took place. But whatever the case may be, though, you have now and we're back in Acts chapter 18, where you have Silas and Timothy, and they arrive from Macedonia. In what we see here is that as soon as they arrive, it says there that Paul was, when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. Okay, so what you have here is, whereas in the previous verse we saw that Paul was primarily preaching the gospel on the Sabbath, and he was reasoning on the Sabbath, and in between that time just preoccupied with his trade. Now that Silas and Timothy have come, And again, if what is saying is correct, where the support from the Philippian church was given to Paul, that frees him up, now that he has that gift, that love offering, to spend more time, not just on the Sabbaths, but on every other day of the week. And so it's when it says that he occupied himself with the word and preaching the word, basically the idea that you get is that he started to work full time in preaching the gospel. And he's not doing the leather working anymore. He's doing exclusive preaching the gospel, not just on the Sabbaths, but throughout the whole time of the week. Okay, so now notice here in this verse it says, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. Now, why does Luke just emphasize the Jews there, whereas before he talked about Jews and Greeks? Well, it's because we're going to see again just kind of the difference between reception and rejection as it relates to the Jews and to the Greeks, or to the Gentiles. And we get that sense in verses 6 and following. Let me read these next few verses here. Starting in verse 6, it says, And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on I will go to the Gentiles. And he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next to the synagogue. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord, together with his entire household. And many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. Okay, so in that range of verses, that was verses 6 through 8. Again, you see a lot of good things happening. But again, like I said, you have the roller coaster ride that goes on in the book of Acts. So you have it has its ups and its downs. And if there's anything that we learn up to this point from the book of Acts, is that when you're engaging in ministry, whether it's a ministry like this with Paul, or even in the small things, it has its challenges, okay? And especially when we're talking about preaching the gospel to lost souls, there's going to be some pushback. And this is the kind of pushback that we're familiar with because, again, as we've said, we've seen Paul having to endure this sort of thing before. And so, it says there in verse 6, and when they, the Jews, and that's why Luke emphasizes the Jews in verse 5, because verse 6, the they are the people who oppose, which again is nothing new. So in verse 6 it says, and when they, the Jews, opposed and reviled him, he, Paul, shook out his garments and said to them, Your blood be on your own heads. Now, we've talked about, and this has been a while ago, so if you don't remember, that's fine because it's been a while ago, but we talked about this whole thing of shaking at least we've talked about shaking the dust off your feet. Here it says it talks about Paul shaking out his garments, but whether you're talking about shaking out your garments or shaking the dust off your feet, the concept or what it was supposed to communicate means the same thing. When we talked about the whole thing of shaking the dust off your feet, remember that I said to you that that was a way that the Jews, if they were in a predominantly Gentile area and they were coming back to a Jewish area, what they would do is that they would shake the dust off their feet so that no Gentile dirt would enter into Jewish territory. So again, that really gives you an idea of the Jewish thought that they had toward Gentiles and how unclean they thought that they were. It was a matter of rejection, of casting off, of setting aside. They didn't want to have anything to do with the Gentiles, not even a grain of dirt. And so that's why they shook the dust off their feet. The whole thing of shaking out the garments was supposed to communicate the same thing. And so that's what Paul was doing. Now, we saw Paul do this, and I think it was the sandals thing, shaking the dust off their feet, back in chapter 13, when he was talking to the Jews that were rejecting the gospel, unlike the Gentiles, who most of them were believing what Paul was saying. And so basically what he was saying and communicating there, just as he is here, is that you are in the same league as those as those dirty Gentiles. If we're talking about completely pagan Gentiles who have nothing to do with anything religious, he's saying, look, you're no different than them, and I reject you along with them. And that's the whole thing that he does with shaking his garments out. That's what that was supposed to communicate. So just imagine that, just the message that said to those unbelieving Jews. Those unbelieving Jews, that's like a slap in the face, really. If you want to, if you really want to think, how would they have interpreted that? That would have been a real severe slap in the face for Paul to do that, to shake out the garments in front of them. And so he says, not only to shake out the garments, but he has a message for them. He says, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." And so it's just interesting. He says, "Your blood be on your own heads." And then he says, "I am innocent." In other words, he's saying, look, I've done everything that I can do. Okay? You've been warned. So if you end up dying and going into eternity in eternal judgment, that's on you. Now, that's not necessarily to say that people's eternal destiny is on other people's shoulders per se. I think what Paul is basically saying, though, is that if we wanted to put some different words to it, it might go something like this, where he would say, look, when the end comes and you're standing in judgment, you can't blame anybody but yourself. You can't say I was never warned. You can't say that, look, I never heard or understood anything about this. You can't use any sort of excuse like that. And even if they really literally didn't hear anything about the gospel, if Paul never came around or no other Christian came around Corinth, they still wouldn't have any excuse, according to Romans chapter 1, right? But what it's basically saying is that you can't say and use as an excuse, well, nobody told me. Nobody told me. Paul is like, look, your blood be on your own head. It's not because of me. I am innocent. Okay? It's not like I saw you in danger and then decided to say nothing. No, I told you and I warned you. And so your blood be on your own head. So if it comes to that reality, when it comes to that reality of your rejection, if you end up going into eternal judgment, you have nobody else to blame. Nobody to blame but yourself. Your blood be on your own head. And I think that's something that's a very important thing for all of us to understand. Right? If you've maybe in a more personal sense, if you've been working on a friend or a family member, or been praying for particular people that they would come to know the gospel, and they're just obstinate and they're hard, and they don't seem to be making any sort of move towards the things of God or anything like that, or they continue to reject. Many people, or even you might fit in this category, might think along the lines of this. They say, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. That's why you have some people say, well, I'm going to have them talk to my pastor, because they think, well, I can't get them to accept the gospel, but if they talk to the pastor, well, then maybe they can come to know the Lord. But listen, that doesn't make any sense. If you're preaching the true gospel, your pastor isn't going to say anything different, or there isn't anything that your pastor can say that's different that will get them to believe. Okay. But this is the whole thing. Some people will put the responsibility on themselves, and they'll put other people's eternal destiny on their shoulders. And so if you have somebody who continues to reject and reject and reject, you may think, man, what am I doing wrong? When it might not be a matter of you doing anything wrong. It's just a matter of somebody in their sinfulness and their hardness of heart doesn't want to have anything to do with Christ, which is the way they came into this world to begin with. Okay? There are many people, you preach the gospel to them, they come to know the Lord, and many other people that you would preach the gospel to, and they say, no, thank you, take a hike. And so, if somebody, God forbid, you've been working on them for a long time, and then they die without ever coming to Christ, without ever repenting of their sins, then you really might think, oh man, I failed God. I couldn't get him to accept the message. No, that is not on you. Their blood, so to speak, and that's just a term that that points forward to the whole thing of the judgment that they would receive. Their blood is on their own head. It's not on you. It's not on you. Their rejection is not your responsibility. The fact that they continue to say no is not your responsibility. That's them. And so that's what Paul is saying here. Paul is saying the same thing. He says, look, I'm innocent. Your blood be on your own head. And if you can identify with that and you have particular people in mind, know that their eternity does not rest on you. They've heard it. They reject it. There's nothing more that you can really do. I mean, except for maybe look for other opportunities, and God might open up those opportunities. Or God might bring some situations in their life where they're forced to ask you more about this Christ thing. But it's not always necessarily a situation where you preach the full and true gospel to them and they don't budge. And they say, what am I doing wrong? Well, it's not about you. It's about their dead hearts. Not wanting to have anything to do with Christ, not wanting to have anything to do with God, not wanting to have anything to do with cleansing from their own sins. That's all that is. And so if they go into that moment of judgment, then the Bible is clear. The only people that they have to blame is themselves. And that's what Paul is saying. And so he says there at the end of verse 6, he says, from now on I will go to the Gentiles. Now, this is the same case of what we saw in chapter 13, because Paul was kind of saying the same thing, similar things in chapter 13 when he was in Pisidian Antioch. The same thing here. We shouldn't understand this as a universal, absolute setting aside of the ministry of Paul to the Jews. Okay, this what he says. From now on, I'm going to the Gentiles. He's talking about that from a regional perspective. Again, that's just the same thing in chapter 13, so the same thing here. When he says, from now on, I'm going to the Gentiles, he's not talking about, from now on, I'm going to the Gentiles wherever I go, and I'm not having any interaction with the Jews. Just like, and we knew that in chapter 13, because in chapter 14, when he goes to a different place, what does he do? He goes right to the Jewish synagogues. And just as in here, we see the same thing in chapter 19. He goes to the Jewish synagogue, so in another place. So what Paul is talking about here, when he says, from now on, I'm going to the Gentiles, he's talking about in that region of Corinth. He's done. The Jews have, he's said what he needed to say. The Jews weren't having it. And so he's saying, look, I'm going to go to the Gentiles. Now, that doesn't mean that Paul didn't have a yearning for the Jews to come to know the Lord, or that he would try to reach the Jews through an indirect way. Is one of the things, if you remember what Paul said in Romans, it's either in chapter 10 or chapter 11. I think it's in chapter 11, where he says that his ministry he made much of his ministry to the the Gentiles, in an attempt to make the Jews jealous. And through that jealousy, that they would come to know the Lord. And that concept that he talks about in Romans chapter 11, I think you see here in Acts chapter 18. Because what do you see here? In verse 7 it says, and he left there and went to the house of a man named Titus Justus, a worshiper of God. Now listen, his house was next door to the synagogue. So he didn't go very far. He left the synagogue. He didn't go to the synagogue anymore. He didn't reason with the Jews in the synagogue anymore, but he just went next door to this guy named Titus Justus. Now, Titus Justus, many people believe is the same person as Gaius. And you read about Gaius in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 as somebody who came to know the Lord and that Paul baptized, okay? And so, and a lot of these people had three names as well. So he might have been known as Gaius Titus Justus, or Titus Gaius Justus, or something like that, or something along those lines. But one thing that we understand is that he is a Gentile, right? It says there that he was a worshiper of God. Does it necessarily mean he was a Christian? And remember, we've seen this sort of thing before with people like Cornelius, and for people like the centurion. That sort of thing. We saw that with the Ethiopian eunuch. You had these Gentiles who were worshipers of God, but were not Christians. Their faith would come to completion, though, when introduced to Christ. And so that's what you have. You have the same thing. You have the same thing there as well. Now, it doesn't say so much here that Gaius came to know the Lord, but again, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, we understand that he did come to know the Lord, and that Paul baptized him. He baptized Gaius and Crispus, which Crispus is going to be mentioned here in the next verse here. But so we understand that he came to know the Lord. Perhaps Gaius was a former attendee of the synagogue that was next door, perhaps. Which would, if that's the case, that would give you this indication that of the openness from the Greek side, and the closed hard-heartedness of the Jewish side as well. Okay, so you have Gaius, or as it says here in this text, Titius Justus, a worshiper of God, who welcomes Paul into his home. It says there that Paul left there, the synagogue, and went to the house of this man, Titius Justus. And his house, and like it says there at the end of that verse, and his house was next door to the synagogue. So Paul has all these things going on, and I would imagine that you have other people who go and hear Paul speak, and all of this is happening right next door to the synagogue. Not out of sight from the people who attend that synagogue. And so maybe I would say that maybe that's one way that Paul was hoping that through that ministry, that not only would he win the Gentiles that he ministers to the Lord, but that through that ministry he would also make the Jews there jealous, and that it would bring them to faith in Christ as well, and that it would open up their hearts to what God has to say through the gospel. That may be perhaps what you have there. Verse 8, like I said, you're introduced to Crispus. It says, Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord, together with his entire household. So you have the ruler, like it says there, Crispus, who is a Gentile, by the way, but a ruler of the synagogue, and I think that's not too hard to understand, because since you had Jews and Greeks who attended the synagogue there. But this Crispus fellow was a Gentile. He was a ruler of the synagogue, and he believed in the Lord, which gives you this understanding that he, after Paul left, maybe he came to know the Lord before Paul left, but whether before or after, he started to cling himself to Paul and Paul's message, and he came to know the Lord. So the synagogue that houses these unbelieving, hard-hearted Jews, they lose a member. This synagogue now loses a member, and the member that they lose is none other than the ruler of their synagogue. So that I would imagine that would continue to stick in the Jews' craw there. And it says in the middle of verse 8, and many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. Now, who all these many other Corinthians were, where they came from, how the word spread or whatever, the text doesn't say, but the understanding that you get, though, is that word is spreading. Paul is preaching the gospel, and you have many of the Corinthians coming to know the Lord. So you have the negatives here of the hard-hearted Jews who were rejecting and reviling Paul, but at the same time you have a good display of conversions from these Gentile Corinthians, some even who are God-fearers, or maybe perhaps from that synagogue, who come to know the Lord. So the Lord is still at work. Nothing can stop the Lord from doing the work that he intends to do. Okay, and that's truly an amazing thing to behold. So that's sort of an encouraging thing as well. Now, what's interesting, though, as we read further, is that Paul apparently needs a little bit more of encouragement as things are going on here. And that's what you kind of read in verses 9 through 11, verses 9 and 10, and then you kind of get a summary statement there in verse 11 where it says, and the Lord said, verse 9, and the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, do not be afraid, but go on speaking, and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people. Okay, now let me just stop there before going to verse 11. That's truly amazing. Now, the do not be afraid in the original, it has this understanding of stop being afraid. So even though you have these amazing things going on, Paul is still apparently on edge about something. And maybe it's because with the growth of converts, which is truly a good thing. That would certainly invite the hostility, whether in words or other word and deed, from the unbelieving Jews. And Paul might have been one who's saying, okay, I'm having all this success. What is this going to do now in bringing about the ire of the other people who are unbelievers, against me? What is this going to look like now? Because remember, Paul is very used to this. He is used to this sort of thing. He's used to seeing these problems flesh themselves out. And it may have been, and again, a lot of this is speculation, but this may have been just a situation where Paul is like, okay, I'm just waiting for this, for an outburst of some sort to happen to me, where they try and kill me or something like that, because of all the success that I'm having in this ministry. Maybe that's what he's thinking. I don't know for sure, but it's a possibility. But whatever the case may be, the Lord Jesus himself encourages Paul in this moment. And he says, do not be afraid. Man, you realize a lot of times how many times the Lord Jesus said that even to his disciples in the Gospels. And he says that here to Paul as well. He says, do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent. He just says, keep going. Now, again, like we said, up to this point, in the previous verse, it said, and many of the Corinthians hearing Paul believed and were baptized. Okay, so Paul is speaking. You have many people coming to the faith, and here the Lord comes to him as all this is going on. He's saying, don't be afraid, keep on speaking, don't be silent, that sort of thing. And then in verse 10, he says, for I am with you, which is totally a comfort, right? And God has always been with Paul. God is always with us. God was with his disciples. Remember, he said that in Matthew 28, and lo, I'm with you always to the very end of the age, right? And we can rest assured in any sort of gospel opportunity. And again, it doesn't have to look exactly like Paul's. It could be in the most intimate of settings, with one-on-one, with a friend, a neighbor, whatever, coworker, you name it, whatever the case may be. There may be that sense of intimidation, that sense of fear. I think that's standard for a lot of people. But the one comfort that we can take in all of this is the fact that Jesus is with us throughout the whole thing. Just as he was with Paul, just as he was with the other apostles, Jesus Christ is with us. Okay, he is with us, and so he says, for in verse 10, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you. Now, isn't that a comfortable thing? That doesn't, by the way, necessarily mean that he's not going to face any more trouble in Corinth. We see that in the verses to follow, but nobody is going to harm him, which may have been the source of Paul's fear. But he says that no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean when he says, for I have many in this city who are my people? Does that mean that there are Christians who have just been hiding out and will make themselves known at some point? No, what the Lord is saying there is that I have many in this people who are my people, he's saying there are many people that I know of who are going to come to the Lord based on your ministry and based on your preaching the gospel. So you have kind of the sovereignty side of the whole thing of election. Remember, we talked about that several weeks ago. Here you have the sovereignty side of it, and we saw a few verses before the human responsibility side as it related to the Jews who rejected what Paul was saying. But here you have Jesus said, "I have many people in this city." What that means is that there are many people who still need to come to know the Lord, and they're going to come to know the Lord by your ministry, by your preaching the gospel. Okay. So I would imagine that Jesus injecting those words was a huge sense of encouragement, served as huge encouragement for Paul as he's going about all of this. Okay, and so in verse 11 it says, "And he stayed a year and 6 months," so a year and a half, teaching the word of God among them. So Paul stayed put for a while. Okay, and as long as the Lord had him there, what he did was that he taught the people, and that he continued to teach the word of God among them. Okay, now Let me read verses 12 through 17, and we'll try and go through this and then call it quits once we go through this section here. But in verse 12, it says, "But when Gallio was proconsul But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, 'This man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law.' But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, 'If it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things.' And he drove them from the tribunal. And they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of this." Okay, so just as we try and draw this thing to a close here, like I said, what Jesus said to Paul in the previous verses doesn't mean that there wasn't going to be an uprising or any sort of trouble that came from the unbelieving side. And we see that from this passage here. So in verse 12, it mentions Gallio, proconsul of Achaia. So he's kind of the top person in the whole province. Okay, and so what you had is that the Jews who go to this person who is higher up, you would imagine that there may have been some lower level people that they could have easily brought Paul before. But they decided to go to the very top, and this would have been Gallio, okay? And it says the Jews made a united attack on Paul, so they're all on the same page on this, which isn't surprising. The Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, "This man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law." Okay, so that's their chief concern. That's their chief complaint. Remember, when it comes to these unbelieving Jews, whether you're talking about Judaizers, which we looked at before, or even with these people here in this chapter, the name of the game for many of these Jews who refused to listen to the things about Christ was the law. The law of Moses was it for them. Okay. And so so a lot of people interpreted the gospel message as something that goes against the law. Okay. And it wasn't something that necessarily went against the law, but when you start preaching Christ and you start preaching grace through faith in Jesus Christ, the one thing that would come through the Jews' mind is that, well, what about the law? Because again, that's what even Paul would bring forth when you read through the book of Romans. The question would be, what about the law? So their whole thing is that this whole message speaks against the law. This is all contrary to the law, and it's contrary to the law in the sense that this is the way of salvation, unlike the law, which you can't gain salvation through the law. But with these Jews, not surprisingly, they're hung up on the law, and so they're saying that this man Paul is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. Now, remember who they're speaking to. They're speaking to Gallio, who is a Gentile, right? Is this going to mean a hoot of beans to somebody like Gallio? No. And he says as much in the following verse, in verse 14. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, he was evidently about to defend himself, Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names in your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things. I like that last part. I refuse to even get involved in something like this. And really, if you think about it, you have these Jews who say, hey, this person's doing things that are contrary to our law. Now, even the Jews would understand, I would think, to a certain extent, that you would think anyway, that the Gentiles wouldn't really have much to say or think about or have any sort of care about the things having to do with the Jewish law. And but I guess they were trying to get rid of Paul in any way that they could, I guess, apparently. But they bring this whole thing before Gallio, and Gallio's like, what is this to me? This means nothing to me. He says, look, if there was sort of a vicious crime, so in other words, if somebody were assaulted, if somebody were murdered or whatever like that, then that would be something that I would be willing to take up. But as it is, it has to do with these little things having to do with your law, the names and customs and things like that. And again, you have to ask the question reasonably, why would Gallio care about any of those things as a Gentile, as a pagan Gentile? Why would he care about any of those things? He wouldn't. And he didn't, and he said as much in that passage. It would just be like us, even though we would believe that there are certain things from a biblical point of view would be wrong or sinful. That would be like us trying to bring somebody to court or before a judge and saying this person had sex with their boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever, and they're not married. And I want you to throw the book at them. The judge would look at you and they say so? Well, why do I care about that? That's not anything that's on the human books. Maybe on the biblical books, but as far as the human books in human law in the United States and everything like that's not a thing. The judge will say, "I don't care. Get out of my courtroom," right? And so it's the same thing here. And so in their desperate attempt to try and get rid of Paul, they bring a Jewish law matter to a Gentile who you wouldn't imagine would have any sort of care in the world as to what what Paul is or isn't doing according to the law. And so he says, I refuse to be a judge of these things. And so verse 16 says, and he drove them from the tribunal. It gives you this understanding. It's like it was a very forceful thing, as if he's saying, get out of my sight, get out. I don't want to be concerned with this nonsense. That's basically what he's saying. Now, verse 17 is very curious and very interesting, and with this we'll close. It says, and they all seized, and they all, I believe, are the Jews who had been driven out, and they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of this. Okay, so what's going on here with this Sosthenes person? You could ask the question: is this person a Jew or a Gentile? I think there are some people who believe that Sosthenes was a Jew, and so the other Jews beat Sosthenes maybe because he was in charge of putting this whole thing together, this united front against Paul. Because of the failure, they were upset and they beat they beat Sosthenes. And then added on to that, you have Gallio, who sees this whole thing and he doesn't step in and he pays them no attention. In other words, he sees them beating Sosthenes, and instead of saying, "Hey, in the name of the law, stop," he says, "Yeah, I don't care," and he just lets it happen. And some people will say, "Well, that indicates that Sosthenes was a Jew," because you have to understand that there is a level of anti-Semitism among many of the Jews, Gentiles, the Greeks, and that sort of thing towards the Jews. And so you have this Jew, Sosthenes, who's unbelieving at the time, who's beat up by his own people. And so that's what you have there. Maybe that's the case. Maybe. I don't dispute that. But there's a part of me that leans towards this idea that Sosthenes is a Gentile, right? Because the name Sosthenes sounds more Greco-Roman in sound than it does any sort of Jewish name. And the fact that he's beaten by the Jews, he may have been a Gentile, but he may have been one of the Greeks, maybe one of the few or maybe a handful of Greek proselytes to Judaism who did not originally accept Paul's message. And so he was still part of the people who had tried to get rid of Paul, and so the Jews are beating him up, as one of their own, in the religious sphere, not ethnically, but in the religious sphere, a Jew who beat him up, and then Gallio, understanding that Sosthenes is a converted Jew, has converted to Judaism, and has no care for the Judaistic system either, says, well, I don't care about what happens to this guy. I don't know. I'm one who tends to think more along the lines of he's a Gentile and who is still connected to the Judaistic system. And so they beat him up, and Gallio pays them no mind. Whatever the case may be, though, this one thing is interesting, Because when you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 1, in the very first verse, you read about Sosthenes. And this is very well could be the same Sosthenes that you read about in Acts chapter 18. Like in the first verse in 1 Corinthians 1:1, it says, Paul, called by the will of God to be an apostle of Christ Jesus, and our brother Sosthenes. So by the time Paul writes 1 Corinthians, he identifies Sosthenes as a brother, which gives you this indication that somewhere down the line, Sosthenes became a believer. And believe me, perhaps if he was of the Jewish persuasion, him being beat up by the Jews may have been a deciding factor for him to turn his ear away from them and start listening to what Paul had to say. These people are nuts. They beat me up, and so he gives ear to Paul, and then he hears the gospel and maybe comes to know the Lord. I don't know if that's exactly how it turned out. I don't know how it turned out specifically. All we know, though, is that somewhere down the line, Sosthenes became a believer, and Paul thinks of him and calls him a brother. So you have, within the Greek circle, you have Gaius or Titius Justus, you have Crispus, and then you have Sosthenes, although it doesn't say anything in Acts 18 about him being converted, but you get the sense that sometime down the road he does. Paul, according to 1 Corinthians 1, baptized Gaius and Crispus, and according to Paul, those are the only people that he baptized. He didn't baptize anybody else, but you had other people coming to know the Lord, so other people were performing those baptisms. But all of this, though, that you see, though, again, you see two sides of a coin here. You see the acceptance side and the rejection side. And most of the acceptance comes from the Gentile side, and most of the rejection side comes from the Jews. And so that's what you see there. But nevertheless, whether Jew or Gentile or whatever you have there, the one thing that you do have is people coming to know the Lord. And that's what's truly important. Even in a place like Corinth, Sin City, at least from a first century perspective, and just what people would know about Corinth, just by reputation, or even from people who live there, they understand that Corinth is Sin City. And they're even in Sin City, Corinth, you see the Holy Spirit doing amazing things in bringing people to faith, and people coming to know the Lord Jesus Christ, which is truly amazing. Okay, so even in that setting, the Lord is still at work, and so I hope you get great encouragement by that. Okay, so we will leave it there. We've covered a sufficient amount of ground here, I think. So we'll leave things there, and we'll pick up in chapter 18 next time. In chapter 18, we're going to see a conclusion of Paul's second missionary journey, and then immediately we're going to see the beginning of his third missionary journey. Plus, we're going to be introduced to Apollos. So, and listen, it's going to be interesting with Apollos. When we think about Apollos, we've already been introduced to Aquila and Priscilla. These are some very stand-up people here. Those people, just as it relates to the faith, you get that sense that their faith is truly solid when you read about them in Scripture, and even when you read about them here in Acts. Now, again, and I'm going to go way back to things that I've mentioned before when it comes to other people in the book of Acts, in other situations of gospel situations. Who is Apollos? Who is Aquila? Who is Priscilla? I mean, were these PhD holders or whatever? I mean, Aquila and Priscilla, they were engaged in leather work, right? That's all we really know about them to a great degree. Apollos, we really don't know much about either, except the fact that he was going around preaching accurately about God. Aquila and Priscilla had to educate him in the ways of Christ more accurately, but I mean, even so, you have a guy who was on fire for the Lord. And he was able, and the Lord was able to use him for amazing things. Now, again, who's Apollos? Other than what we see here, I mean, does he come across as somebody of noble importance? Maybe somebody of royal line or whatever? No, he's just a guy. And so that goes back to the whole, God using ordinary people. See, we read the accounts in the book of Acts, and we think of these people as big people because we read about them all the time in Scripture. And they did such amazing things, or the Lord would use them to do amazing things. But really, when you get down to the bare bones of it, what we continually see and what we continue to understand is that God used ordinary people to turn the world upside down at that time as the things of the book of Acts was unfolding. So we're going to look at some of that when we go into this next time. And what we'll probably do, we'll try and finish up the chapter 18 next time. And I'm pretty confident that we'll have the ability to do that. Okay, so like I said, we'll leave it there. If you like this show, and if you've come across Loving the Scriptures for the first time, and you'd like to hear more about our study of the Book of Acts, and just seeing what's unfolded there, or whatever the case may be sure to subscribe to my show on iTunes. Also, feel free to check out Loving the Scriptures on Twitter. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS. Which stands for Loving the Scriptures. All right, friends, good time in the Word, as always, at least from my perspective anyway. I always enjoy this time, and looking forward to the next time when we get together and we look at the rest of Acts chapter 18. My name is Steve Gill, and I hope to see you right back here next time.